49 out of 100. That's the Metacritic score Final Fantasy, the 14th, landed with when it launched in September 2010 for a franchise whose numbered entries had, until then, never dropped anywhere close to that low. 13 weeks later, Square Enix did something almost unheard of for a subscription game. It stopped charging for it, not for a week. Not for a month, indefinitely, with no date fixed for when billing would resume. You already know how this story usually gets told. A studio built something broken. A savior arrived from outside, listened to the fans, and fixed it. Disaster, outsider triumph. It's been told that way so many times it barely needs footnotes anymore. I don't think it's wrong exactly. I think it's incomplete, in two specific, checkable ways, and both times the actual record turns out to be more useful than the legend. First, this wasn't simply a story of incompetence. It was a story of a genuinely skilled team optimizing hard, with real craft, for the wrong target, and, separately, a team making the specific mistakes that come from never having built this kind of game before. Both things are true at once. A version of this story that only tells you the flattering half is a worse story. Second, the rescue was not a clean slate. Two names carried real continuity from the wreck straight into the recovery. Nobuaki Komodo, the original director, was demoted rather than fired and stayed on for 2 more expansions. Masayoshi Soken, the original sound director, was promoted rather than sidelined into lead composer. Around them, the rest of the leadership genuinely did turn over. And the producer everyone calls the outsider who swept in to fix everything had already been inside Square Enix for the better part of a decade, running a different, massively multiplayer game before he ever touched this one. This video is built from investor transcripts, contemporary reviews, and the producer's own interviews, cross-checked against each other. Where a claim traces back to one unverifiable source, I'll say so. Where the record has a real gap, I'll say that too. Let's start where Square Enix started, not with a failure, with a team that had already won. Chapter 1: What Square Enix Thought It Was Building. Final Fantasy XI, launched in 2002, had made Square its first real money in the MMO genre, reportedly peaking near 2 million subscribers, by industry estimate rather than an audited figure. So when planning began for a successor in 2005, 4 years before anyone outside the company saw it, Square Enix didn't hand the project to unknowns. It handed the project to the people who had already won. Hiromichi Tanaka, XI's producer and by then a senior vice president, took the producer's chair. He had been at the company since 1983, on the design team for the first 3 Final Fantasy games, before producing Xenogears and Chrono Cross, before running XI itself for 8 years. This is about as senior and credentialed as game development gets. Nobuaki Komodo, who had directed chunks of XI's own expansions, became director. 5 of 14's playable races were lifted directly from XI's 5 starting races, on purpose, so veteran players could look at a race and already know how it would play. Then, at Gamescom in August 2009, Tanaka said the sentence I think is the actual hinge of this whole story. Eorzea would be smaller than XI's world, but, in his words, filled with more content and more detail. Quality, not quantity. Komodo put the whole project's keyword even more simply: growth. And he said the thing every producer says and mostly means, that the voice of the users is very important, especially in an MMO. Sit with Tanaka's phrase, though, because I'm coming back to it more than once. That is not an offhand marketing line. That is the stated design thesis of the entire project, said out loud a full year before launch by the producer himself. And it is precisely, mechanically, the thesis that is about to break the game. I want to be clear about what this chapter is not. It is not a story about a team that didn't know what it was doing. This was Square Enix's varsity roster, applying an approach that had already made the company one of the most successful MMO publishers alive, to a direct sequel of that exact success. The failure that's coming wasn't a competence failure. It was competence aimed at the wrong thing. Chapter 2: An engine built for 3 different games. Final Fantasy XIV ran on an internal engine called Crystal Tools, and Crystal Tools is, almost by itself, the explanation for why the game failed. The engine began development in August 2005, scoped at that point only for Final Fantasy XIII, a linear, single-player game. 5 months later, Square Enix expanded its mandate to also cover an open-world action RPG and the MMO that would become 14. 3 different genres, 1 shared engine, being specified and hardened at the same time client teams were already building on top of it. The engine itself wasn't even finished until September 2007, meaning 14's own team had been building against a moving target for close to 2 years before the ground beneath them settled. This isn't speculation. Separate internal groups built individual engine tools without unified documentation, and client teams built asset pipelines against specs that weren't locked yet. Final Fantasy XIII's own producer, Yoshinori Kitase, said publicly that building a new engine from scratch alongside a new game may have been a mistake. The open-world team hit the identical wall and abandoned the engine outright in 2011, jumping to something else entirely. So 14 wasn't just built on the wrong engine. It was built on an engine being finalized in real time for 3 incompatible projects at once, an institutional decision made in the name of efficiency that instead multiplied the risk across all 3. Here's the clearest first-person diagnosis of what that actually meant in practice. When Yoshida's team later inventoried everything they wanted to fix, they found roughly 10,000 individual problems. By his own account, in a 2017 interview, something like 80% of them could not be fixed within the original release because the structure at the heart of the game itself was broken. That's not a UI complaint. That's a statement that the Foundation could not support the constant, live, server-side iteration an MMO actually needs. The engine's own design brief prized attractive visuals over accurate physics. Brilliant for a 40-hour single-player game with pre-rendered cutscenes. Applied to a genre that needs to produce far more geography and far more live-updated systems than any linear game ever will, that same spec becomes a liability because the fidelity has to be paid for somewhere. We're about to see exactly what it was paid for with. Chapter 3, The Flowerpot. By Yoshida's own account, as reported from press coverage of his 2014 GDC talk, an ordinary decorative flowerpot outside and in 14's original version was built with roughly 1,000 polygons and about 150 lines of shader code. I want to flag that sourcing up front, no primary transcript of that talk is publicly available, only consistent second-hand reporting from several outlets. With that caveat, the figure is comparable to the budget spent on an actual player character. He reportedly called it the loveliest flowerpot in any MMO. Multiply that per object cost across every environment in the game, and you get a direct mechanical consequence, a hard cap of roughly 20 players visible on screen at once. In a genre whose entire appeal is the crowd, the city that feels alive, the world event that feels like an event, that cap isn't a bug. It's what's left over after the rendering budget already got spent on flowerpots. Building an object like that is hard. It takes real craft. Nobody stumbles into 150 lines of shader code for a prop nobody will ever inspect closely. A team did that on purpose because everything Square Enix had ever rewarded them for said visual craftsmanship was the thing that mattered. That's competence, pointed at the wrong target. But I don't think that explanation covers everything, and I think it matters to say so plainly. The market wards, the actual economic engine of the game, shipped with no search function at all. 20 identical sub-areas, 10 stalls each, and a player looking for one specific item had to check every stall by hand. By eye, that's not a rendering budget trade-off. Every other MMO on the market already had a search bar. And the interface itself had been built around a PlayStation controller for a console version that hadn't shipped yet, then handed largely unmodified to the PC players who actually showed up first. Those aren't the marks of craft misapplied. They're the marks of a team that, in Yoshida's own words, largely lacked prior MMO development experience. The Flowerpot explains the render cap. It does not explain the missing search bar. Both things happen to the same game, for different reasons, and the honest version of this story has to hold both at once. Chapter 4: The Verdict of the Reviews. Final Fantasy XIV launched worldwide for Windows on September 30th, 2010, after a collector's edition early access window that had opened 8 days earlier. The PlayStation 3 version, the platform the interface had actually been designed for, was still months away. The reviews were about as bad as a mainline Final Fantasy has ever received. IGN gave it 5.5 out of 10 and called it not a world worth visiting. GameSpot gave it 4 out of 10. GameSpy, at 2 out of 5, wrote that without a complete overhaul of the interface, the combat, and the layout of the world itself, the game was unlikely to ever be fun. Game Trailers called it released before it was finished. Eurogamer told readers to wait 6 months before even considering it. PC Gamer, at 30%, called it a shallow, grind-heavy MMO crippled by a horrible interface. What's striking, reading across 8 outlets that weren't talking to each other, is how consistent the split is. Nearly all of them agreed the graphics and Nobuo Uematsu's score were genuinely good. Nobody disputed the craftsmanship. And nearly all of them agreed the interface, the combat pacing, and an overall sense of an unfinished game were what actually broke the experience. That split isn't a coincidence. It's independent confirmation from 8 separate newsrooms that never compared notes of the exact same shape. The parts of the game the team poured its craft into were praised. The parts an MMO actually depends on, responsiveness, tools, systems that reward showing up, were the parts that failed. Square Enix's own conduct in the days after tells you how seriously the company took that verdict. Player backlash was immediate, not slow building, and Square Enix's own public language conceded the problem within days rather than defending the launch. Within about 3.5 weeks, the company was already extending the free trial to placate players. Within 10 weeks, it had removed the entire leadership team from the project. That is not the timeline of a company managing a rough review cycle. That's the timeline of a company that looked at its own flagship launch and concluded, almost immediately, that the building was on fire and that the fire had a price tag attached. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. 5 weeks after launch, at the November 4th, 2010 investor briefing, President and CEO Yoichi Wada told analysts directly that customers were not, at present, fully satisfied, and that the company was doing everything in its power to regain their trust. He called 14 a cornerstone of the group's own corporate strategy. Then, 10 weeks after launch, on December 10th, 2010, Square Enix acted. It removed producer Hiromichi Tanaka and director Nobuaki Komodo from their posts, installed Naoki Yoshida as combined producer and director, postponed the PlayStation 3 version indefinitely, and suspended subscription fees for the PC version, with no fixed end date attached. That suspension is worth sitting with as a number, because it's a clean one, unlike almost everything else about this story's finances. Paid subscriptions didn't resume until January 6, 2012, at a discounted $9.99 a month. Added up, and Square Enix ran a full-price subscription MMO for roughly 15 months while collecting essentially no subscription revenue, by its own choice, because it judged that charging for a broken game would cost more in trust than the money was worth. 6 days after the leadership change, on December 16th, the company cut its full-year profit forecast by more than 90%, from a projected 12 billion yen down to 1 billion, citing 14 alongside broader weak console sales. I want to be precise here rather than dramatic. There is no single, clean, Square Enix disclosed figure that isolates what this specific failure cost. The numbers that eventually came out of that fiscal year got tangled up with an unrelated goodwill write-down and earthquake losses from the following March. The guidance cut is the honest number. A bigger, scarier figure you may have seen quoted elsewhere probably isn't. One quote gets misplaced constantly in retellings of this story, so let me place it correctly. Yoichi Wada's line that the Final Fantasy brand had been greatly damaged did not come from this crisis week in 2010. It came from a Tokyo press conference on September 27, 2011, nearly a full year later, and in the same breath he paired it with a promise to keep reforming the game and revive the 14 that should have been released. A year of continued work sat between the crisis and that sharpest public admission. Whatever was happening in that year, it wasn't a company standing still. Chapter 6: The Man Who Wasn't a Stranger. Here is the legend. Square Enix reached outside the failed project and brought in a total unknown to fix what the insiders had broken. It's a good story. It's also not really what the record shows. Naoki Yoshida had no prior credits on 14. That part is true. He was an outsider to this specific project. But he was not an outsider to Square Enix, and he was not an outsider to massively multiplayer games. He joined the industry in 1993 at Hudson Soft, working on the Bomberman series and contributing scenario work elsewhere, before leaving over creative differences around 1998. In 2004, producer Yasuke Saito brought him onto what became Dragon Quest X, where he served as chief designer and writer. When the director needed to step back in late 2007, he named Yoshida acting director of that MMO for roughly a year and a half, citing what the record describes as his indisputable competence. That's the fact the outsider version of this story quietly drops. The man who took over 14 had already directed a different Square Enix MMO for actual years before he ever touched this one. He was also, by his own description across many later interviews, a genuinely hardcore MMO player going back to Ultima Online and EverQuest, well before this project existed at all. Wada's own stated reasoning for the appointment cited Yoshida's experience, along with what the record describes as charismatic leadership and passionate commitment to customer satisfaction. None of which means the appointment wasn't a gamble. It was his first time producing anything, and he was pulled off a half-finished, unrelated Western-style project, one Square Enix had sent him to study as part of a small internal group nicknamed the Stray Dogs, to take the job. His own account of first playing the broken version is blunt. Honestly, it couldn't get any worse, he said, describing basics like targeting and menus that didn't work cleanly. So hold both facts at once. He had never touched this specific game before, and he had spent the better part of a decade inside the company that made it, directing the closest thing Square Enix had to a dry run for exactly this crisis. The question the legend skips entirely is what happened to the team he actually inherited. That's next. Chapter 7: Two Names That Stayed. The other half of the outsider myth is that the recovery meant purging everyone who built the failure. It didn't, but I want to be precise about exactly how far that continuity actually extends, because overstating it would be its own kind of dishonesty. Nobuaki Komodo, the original director, was demoted, not dismissed. He stayed on the project as lead game designer through the relaunch and its next 2 expansions, 2 more full expansions, under the regime that supposedly replaced him. Masayoshi Soken, the original sound director, was promoted, not replaced. He had worked under composer Nobuo Uematsu, rather than as lead composer himself. On the rebuild, he became both sound director and lead composer, eventually composing 384 unique tracks by the time of the Stormblood expansion in 2017. Enough for Guinness to certify the game as having the largest single soundtrack ever released for a video game. That's real, specific, checkable continuity, not a vague sense that some people stayed. 2 named, senior figures carried craft and institutional memory directly out of the wreck and into the fix. And it matters that neither was a token gesture. Komodo's demotion still put him in the room for every major design call on 2 entire expansions, and Soken's promotion handed him creative ownership of the single, most decorated part of the whole soundtrack's legacy. But here's the part that doesn't fit a clean continuity story either. Tanaka, the producer, arguably the most senior figure on the original team, did not stay long-term. He remained attached to another Square Enix team for a year and a half, then announced his departure from the company entirely in June 2012, citing health reasons, and joined the rival studio Gung Ho Online Entertainment months later. Beneath Komodo, the design, art, and programming leads were, by contemporary reporting, wholesale replaced. So neither version of the legend survives contact with the record. Not the team stayed. Not a clean slate. What actually happened is narrower, and I think more interesting. Two people carried real continuity through the failure and into the recovery, while most of the leadership layer around them, and the most senior name on the original credits, genuinely did not survive the transition. Both things were true at the same time. The legend only ever tells you one of them. Chapter 8: The Calamity. On December 28, 2010, Yoshida's team gathered to report everything they had found wrong with the game. He sent everyone home, telling them he would review it all himself over the New Year holiday. By his own account, there was so much to fix that thinking it over gave him a fever. On New Year's Day, sitting under his kotatsu, a television program came on about the Mayan prophecy that the world would end in 2012. There was no rebuild plan yet, only the certainty that the maps would all have to be remade from scratch. And if they had to be rebuilt anyway, he thought, blowing up the world first might be pretty interesting. That is the moment the plot of the 7th Umbral Calamity began. What I find genuinely remarkable is that nobody had to be talked into it. Soken has said his own department had already been joking, independently, that they wished a meteor would just blow the whole thing up so they could start over. Development supervisor Hiroshi Takai has said the team nodded in agreement the instant they heard the pitch. And underneath, the drama sits a very practical piece of engineering logic. Old MMO relaunches routinely get tangled in messy data migration between old and new versions. A hard, definitive, in fiction ending sidesteps that problem entirely. You don't have to reconcile two worlds if you have narratively destroyed one of them. The story they wrote. A Garlean commander summons a second moon down toward the planet as a weapon. The previously fractured nations of Eorzea unite to storm the fortress driving it. They destroy the summoning beacon, only for the moon to disintegrate anyway, revealing it was never a moon at all but a prison, holding an elder primal that is immediately freed and unleashed on Eorzea. On November 11, 2012, Square Enix staged a final battle open to any remaining player, culminating in the servers shutting down forever, followed immediately by a cinematic, titled end of an era, dramatizing that same destruction for whoever had logged in to watch. They didn't hide the failure. They staged its funeral, let the people who had stuck around watch it happen, and then opened the sequel by admitting, inside the story itself, that something terrible had happened to this world. Chapter 9: What Rebuilding Actually Cost. By Yoshida's own repeated public accounting, the entire rebuild, from his December 2010 appointment to the August 2013 launch, took 2 years and 8 months. Against an industry norm, he put it 4 to 5 years for a new MMO built from scratch. Roughly 2 months of that were spent purely on design, with no code written at all. The controller interface alone, the system built so a player on a gamepad could act in as few inputs as someone on mouse and keyboard, consumed about a year and 9 months of dedicated, continuous refinement, running the whole time alongside everything else. I want to be honest about what I can't tell you, because I think that's more useful than filling the gap with a number that only sounds authoritative. A figure for how many people worked on this rebuild circulates widely online. It does not trace back to any specific statement by Yoshida or Square Enix that I could locate anywhere in the record. So I'm not using it here, and I'd be skeptical of anyone who states it as settled fact. The working conditions picture needs the same restraint. What exists isn't investigative labor reporting, no regulatory filing, no union statement. What exists is first-person testimony Square Enix itself published in a celebratory anniversary magazine years later, team members describing an intense period in their own words, largely with a laugh in the delivery. Soken has said things were pretty crazy back then, that they were like machines. That reads as real intensity. It does not read as an exposé, and I'm not dressing it up as one just because the story would land harder that way. There is a separate figure worth naming precisely because it is real and documented. The shipped game's full credits list more than 1,200 individually credited people. But that spans years of development, live operations, localization, and quality assurance together, not a snapshot of the build period team, and conflating the two would be its own small dishonesty. So here's the honest ledger. Time, 2 years and 8 months, well documented. Money, large but never isolated into one figure by the company itself. Headcount, genuinely unknown. Human cost, probably real, evidenced only by warm, self-selected retrospective testimony rather than anything independently verifiable. The rebuild was expensive. I can tell you that with confidence. I can't tell you exactly how expensive, and I would rather say that than make a number up. Chapter 10, The Realm Reborn. A Realm Reborn launched worldwide on August 27, 2013, and it broke almost immediately, under demand, which is the good version of that sentence. So many players showed up that Square Enix had to suspend digital sales just to manage the load, then run a 10-hour maintenance window to add capacity. A launch problem of too many people showing up is a categorically different problem than a launch where the thing people showed up for simply doesn't work. Critical reception flipped completely. Metacritic put the PC version at 83, and Famitsu, Japan's own benchmark, gave it 39 out of 40. But the review I actually want to end on is GameSpot's, because I think it states the thesis of this entire video better than any retrospective interview does. Its critic praised the writing, but noted the design itself does not leap over the shoulders of the games that came before it. That's not faint praise. That's the entire recovery strategy, described precisely by someone who didn't know the internal reasoning behind it. Yoshida made roughly 400 core design decisions up front, specifically to kill time lost to internal debate, and by his own account, had the team spend a year studying World of Warcraft rather than trying to differentiate the game from 11. The original version failed by optimizing hard for craftsmanship over live service fundamentals. The rebuild succeeded by optimizing, just as hard, for unglamorous, proven correctness. So, does the corrected thesis survive contact with the evidence? Mostly. But here's the honest weak point, because a channel built on checking its own work has to name it. The single most load-bearing piece of evidence in this video, the Flowerpot, the render cap, the craftsmanship over content diagnosis, comes entirely from press coverage of one talk I could not access in primary form. Every outlet I found agrees with every other outlet, which is real corroboration. But they're all describing the same single event, once removed. If a verified transcript ever surfaced and showed Yoshida's actual language was softer, more hedged, or focused on process rather than a deliberate graphics-first philosophy, the cleanest evidence in this video would need to be walked back. That's the standard I'm holding this video to, not whether it's a good story, whether it's still true once someone checks.